Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dan, for once again answering the call of service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, for once again standing beside Dan as he answers the call of service. It's good to see you back here, and I congratulate you on your nomination. We've spoken some about the unique challenges and opportunities of trying to integrate all 17 agencies within the intelligence community that you'll face as the DNI. You're obviously very familiar with them. You're familiar with the kind of intelligence products they each produce and the priorities that they each have. Have you any thoughts on what actions can be taken in the very short run to make that process work more efficiently and to produce a coherent picture for policymakers of what's happening in the world overseas in your role as DNI?
Obviously, there's a lot that I need to learn. I want to get acquainted with the various leaders of the agencies. But as I have said before, given the nature of the threats that we face, we need to act sooner rather than later. I've always believed that getting the right people in place is what can best execute the doctrine in terms of achieving the goals that you want to achieve. And so we will quickly, if confirmed, move into that mode of filling that up. I did recognize earlier on the previous leaders of the ODNI and the smooth transition that they have arranged by ensuring that there's continuity during this gap period of time. But this is one of the, this rises to an early responsibility.
One of the original purposes of the ODNI was to take the disparate kinds of intelligence that is collected by our intelligence agency, be it human intelligence, bank records, satellite imagery, email and telephone intercepts, passenger manifest, and synthesize them all together to create a coherent picture. I think that's an important function, and it still can play that function in part today. One thing I've heard on occasion from my visits to the various agencies and talking with their frontline personnel is that the DNI over time has imposed bureaucratic mandates on the agencies, reporting requirements, HR requirements, and so forth, that get their core collectors or their analysts out of the business of core collection and analyzing and spend too much of their time focused on fulfilling those bureaucratic mandates. Have you seen that in your preparation, and do you have any thoughts about how you might focus the DNI on that original mission and keep the constituent agencies of the IC focused on their original mission?
Well, I haven't had enough experience to evaluate that. I will certainly take that as a issue to address. But without the confirmation, I haven't had the opportunity to engage with the other 16 agencies, except to begin to formulate some relationships with a few of them, starting with the Director of Central Intelligence. We've had a number of occasions to just talk to each other and share what we think the concerns are and what we think we need to do. I think that relationship is a very important relationship, maybe the first important relationship. So we're already working to establish that.
Thank you. Finally, you mentioned the Rob Silberman Commission in your opening statement. That was a commission of experts tasked to recommend ways to ensure that the intelligence community, quote, is sufficiently authorized, organized, equipped, trained, and resourced, end quote. What kind of lessons, if any, would you take away from the reports of the Rob Silberman Commission, and how applicable are those today, recognizing that we're about a decade on?
Well, not all of those recommendations were implemented. I think it's worth going back and looking at the original intent, and then the reports from Rob Silberman, and they made a number of recommendations which were constructive. But I just think after 12 years or so, the agency clearly has evolved into what it is today. But taking a look back at where it was intended in the first place to go, and as I said, this was a compromised piece of legislation, like most legislation, and it was interesting that in the articles I was reading, they talked to the former directors and a total of 8 people who were in a position to make an assessment as to what exactly the authorities of the DNI were, and there were 8 different answers. And so I think that alone is a signal that we ought to perhaps go back and look and see if we want to make some adjustments to the law. Now, that would have to be done in conjunction with the Congress, of course. But at some point, I think maybe sooner rather than later, that would be something we ought to look at.
Thank you, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Senator Cornyn.